For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe.
The inside of the fingernails are polished. The artistic lotus flower motif on the side of the throne here is polished. And this polished finish, which when shown next to the writing, shows us one of the hugely obvious contradiction when it comes to the varying level of technologies that we observe in ancient Egypt. The technology reflected in the writing on this statue does not remotely reflect the technology that was used to make the statue itself. It doesn't even come close.
Just as alternative researchers go from site to site, separating the good parts from the bad parts, and attributing the good parts to a lost advanced civilization from the Stone Age and the bad parts to the indigenous peoples, so here Ben is now doing the same thing with single objects. Whatever he considers to be less impressive must have been done by the natives.
The glyphs carved into these objects display the signature and the marks that handheld chisels leave when used on stone in a manner like this. Compared to the object itself, the writing is generally always pretty rough work. The builders obviously had the ability to polish any surface at any angle, as I've just shown, yet the writings are never polished, even in large symbols with plenty of space. Look at this box, for example. Although it's heavily weathered, you can still see the light that reflects from its surface. Yet, despite it being utterly covered in hieroglyphs, you can see the obvious hand tool nature of the work and how the writings were made by chipping away at the polished stone.
Yes, because why would anyone engrave an object before it was finished? Earlier, Uncharted X stressed the importance of consulting with people today who actually do the kind of work that we are studying. I'm curious if you consulted with any sculptors. Would they agree that, apart from the glyphs, the absence of chisel marks on the statue, the smooth finish, means that a chisel was not used upon it? Does Ben think that Michelangelo's David displays the signature marks of a handheld chisel? How does he think it got so smooth? With power tools? I'm not sure Ben really knows how sculptors finish their creations. Here's a video which shows you how. After using different types of hammers and chisels to sculpt the form, sculptors use a rasp file to smooth the surfaces. This is common practice and was done by hand up until, well, many people still do it by hand. And it's quite clear that with handheld tools, beautifully smooth stone creations can be made. Indeed, I would say that handmade sculpture is far superior to sculpture made by machines. And most sculptors probably would agree with me.
Look at the writing on this box in the Serapeum. We've looked at it before. But I like to make the point that if the builders could make perfectly straight lines in the object itself, they could make perfectly square corners like those seen on the interior. Why then couldn't they manage to draw a straight line on the outside of the box?
Okay, that is obviously a draft. I don't see how anyone would think that's a final version.
The simplest answer is because the writing most likely came later and was done by a civilization that lacked the same capability to work the stone.
He gives far less credit to Bronze and Iron Age cultures than I do. It's in his interest to make the ancient Egyptians look as ignorant, disorganized, and powerless as possible. Is Ben saying that the Egyptians were never able to make a straight line or to make square corners? I mean, there are plenty of examples of them making both. So surely he can't be saying that. Of course, he could just say that every example of a square corner or a straight line wasn't made by Egyptians. Remember, no true Scotsman. But there are examples that are undeniably Egyptian, because we have chiseled glyphs, the lines of which are straight, and we have corners of buildings that are straight. So if the Egyptians could make straight lines and straight corners, then every time we find one that isn't very straight, what should we conclude? The same as when we see both excellent and shoddy work today. The logical conclusion is simply that that particular artist wasn't as adept as others.
This is my friend Yusuf Ayawan. He's a master stonemason, a chematologist, and the son of the legendary indigenous wisdom keeper Hakim El Ayawan, and he's been studying these objects and ancient Egypt his entire life. He understands in a way that few do what it really takes to work in and carve stone, both by hand and with power tools, and he really knows what he's talking about. I greatly respect his perspective and his knowledge, and I agree with him when it comes to the technology level that we see in the writing.
Just so you know, chematology is not a science, it's a spiritual movement. I don't know why Ben is listing it as a credential. Anyway, the problem with going to a modern stonemason for answers about how things were made is that he will give you modern answers. How can you make judgments about ancient engineering without knowledge of the content of documents that refer to the engineering, without knowing the mathematics that they use to make their calculations, without knowledge of all the artifacts that have been discovered that would relate to the item under discussion, without knowledge of what neighboring civilizations were doing?
There's some nuance here to explain. The dynastic Egyptian civilization lasted a very long time, many thousands of years. They eventually developed iron tools, and although this was long after the Old Kingdom, they certainly developed the ability to do very fine work into hard stone. I'd imagine that being a scribe or a stone carver and writing hieroglyphs was a lifelong trade, and would have taken decades of training to become truly proficient.
Here Ben acknowledges that the Egyptians of later times were able to make fine work out of hard stone, but earlier he pointed to actual objects from these times, and said that the Egyptians could not have made them.
This proficiency in writing extended even to erasing old glyphs and replacing them. This process is well demonstrated by an example here at Tanis on this obelisk fragment. See how the bird glyph is being blended into the writing? I think that this is why Ramses II seems to have had his name on everything. Once he tagged it, it was his forever, and we still attribute endless statues and monuments to him, while I think the truth is more likely that he was just the last guy to write his name on something that was vastly more ancient. Undoubtedly, some of the carving that's been done into obelisks and statues is really excellent work. It looks very sharp and well defined, particularly on obelisks like this example at Karnak Temple.
Now, let me be clear. It has been demonstrated by Egyptologists that later rulers of Egypt often appropriated the artistic works of their predecessors and put their own names on them. This is because they have actual evidence of this. They can see, for example, where names have been written over. They don't imagine it and say it's true. They have the evidence. But this can't be used as an argument to support what Ben is saying, because it's another matter entirely to say that Egyptians appropriated things from another civilization. It's not the same type of claim. It's apples and oranges. Another civilization that happened to look exactly like theirs, by the way.
However, as Yusuf said, even with these examples, he knows how it was done, and it was done with hand tools. He's lived and travelled in Egypt his whole life, and he's never seen any writing that reflects machining or the use of power tools. We do, however, see this evidence on the objects themselves, on the boxes, on the slabs, on the columns, the obelisks, and on the statues.
So, not only the boxes, slabs, and statues were created by this lost civilization, but the columns and obelisks too? Interesting, because even if we take the hieroglyphs off of them, we still have depictions in Egyptian art of Egyptians moving obelisks to their location, which means they would have had to have raised the obelisks too.
The writing is, without fail, always used to date the sites and to date the objects that are found on the sites, despite in many cases there being a huge disparity in technology levels. How could anyone say that these poorly made scratches into this incredible box at the Serapeum were made by the same people that made the box itself? Yet this is exactly how we date and relate this site and its objects. At the Serapeum, this box is considered to be the most valuable because it has writing on it. I would prefer to call this what it is, a priceless, high-technology, ancient object that was inherited and then vandalized with a chisel by a later and far less capable ancient culture.
This ignores the fact that the Egyptians had a widespread sarcophagus industry, which is documented in their writings and in archaeological remains. Here's another question for Ben. Do you think that in a single society, the same people do both the sculpting and the engraving? Or do you think that in a large society there would be a division of labor? According to what we read in Egyptian writings and see in Egyptian art, the craftsmen that made the statues are not the same as the ones that did the engraving. That being the case, I have this follow-up question. Were all craftspeople in Egypt do you think, equally skilled at their craft? Or do you think that, as in our own society, some were better at it than others? If you think that some were better than others, then difference in ability does not necessarily equate to difference of civilization, does it? Let's look at the wider picture here for a second. Believers in a lost advanced civilization know that the writings contradict their claims. So by finding a way that they can dismiss the evidence of the writings, they can disregard them altogether when dating artifacts, even if the writing is directly on the artifact, and even if the writing says explicitly that the object was made contemporarily. This is far too convenient, in my opinion.